Joseph, hello.
Hello, Mike.
Hi. Joseph Garfield is an IT project manager who specializes in managing large teams to plan and deliver complex technology projects and programs. Through Joseph's business, which is Phase 3 IT project management, he's developed a simple and effective approach for setting up and operating a robust yet simple project with a light touch. The three phases of Joseph's P3 approach are discover, design, and deliver. And the starting point is discovering what the users and what the stakeholders need from the project. And that's why I wanted to talk to Joseph today about getting a clear scope for your project. Joseph, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Mike. I appreciate it.
Joseph, I think the first thing we need to do is to establish why scoping is such an important part of your approach to project management, and also, I have to say, to mine as well. Why do you consider it so important?
Honestly, Mike, I don't think there's a more important phase of project management, because if you don't scope your project out, you can build your ladder against the wrong wall. If you don't have a solid foundation for project success, if you're not clear with your key stakeholders and your project sponsors on what you're trying to accomplish, chances are you're going to be accomplishing the wrong thing and waste a lot of time and money in course corrections later on.
I love that metaphor, your ladder against the wrong wall. I use the foundation metaphor, but I've never heard that. I love that. That's great. And I very much agree with that. I've never kind of thought particularly about scoping being the most important, but I do think that scoping is the hardest part of project management, because you've got to balance pleasing this group of stakeholders and upsetting that group on one issue, and then on another issue you might have to do the other way around, and you've all got to do that within a finite resource pool, a finite budget, and a finite schedule. So what's the first step? How do we get started getting this right from day one?
Well, I think the first thing you have to do is identify who are the key stakeholders, right? Who do you really have to please? I mean, everybody has an opinion, as you well know, as you've mentioned. But what's important for a project manager is ultimately who are the people whose opinions and what they want determines the success or failure of your project.
Yeah.
Right. That's who your key stakeholders are. I think it's important to gather opinions and gather insights from multiple sources. But in the end, you have to identify who are the people that can make or break your project success, and make sure that those are the people that you interview, that you talk to, that you get their inputs. And ultimately, before you finish, you want to review your project charter, or review your project scope statement with all of your key stakeholders, and make sure you have agreement and alignment before you move forward. But you've got to make sure you have the right people identified to interview and make sure you get their input.
Every project's different, so I know that there's no one single answer to this, but can you put your finger on some of the generic stakeholder groups that are often going to feature, that are going to be at the top of your mental list before you even start to think about who the real stakeholders are? Who's likely to be the key players?
I think the first one, the most obvious one, is who signs the check.
Absolutely.
Who ultimately pays for the project? Who's paying the bill? So that's a key stakeholder. Another key stakeholder is when your project finishes, who's going to use it? Who's going to be in charge of the, as project managers, a lot of the time, I think we get tunnel vision. We focus on completing the project, but especially in IT, when you finish your project, you're generally handing off to an operational support staff.
Yes.
So whatever you just delivered, they now have to support and maintain. And so it's vital to get those key stakeholders, for example, a network manager, a server manager, your CTO, your CIO, also, even your service desk manager. Who will you be handing this off to that will have to carry it forward? Because a project succeeds or fails, not just when the project finishes, but in the long term, whatever you delivered, was that successful, and is that continuing to be used in an operational environment? So those are a few examples. I think obviously your customers, if you have a few customers that can make that are very vital to this being successful, you want to include those people, those leaders. Generally, I'd say key stakeholders are leadership. They're people that are in positions to make decisions, and that you have to make sure that you have their involvement, especially if you need project resources that report to them. So if you
Yeah.
have people on your project team, whoever they report to, make sure that they're involved, and they're probably a key stakeholder.
Yeah. I often like to think about actually who in the kind of ecosystem of stakeholders could cause your project to fail, not because you've done the wrong things, but because they've not liked what you've done. And I think, I don't know about the environments you've worked in, but I've worked in quite a lot of heavily legislated and heavily regulated areas. And so we always like to ask the question, what are the rules? What's the law? What's the regulation? What's the legislation around this? And who do we have to please on that? But the thing I like the way you express it, who's paying the bill? Although what I do think is that for less experienced viewers, they're thinking, oh, excellent, that's an easy answer, I can go to that. But I think you and I know that sometimes that's not as easy to understand as possible, because if it's an organization that's paying the bill, then there are going to be a lot of senior stakeholders who think they're in charge, perhaps as a board or as a sponsoring group, they are in charge, but that doesn't mean that they all see the world in exactly the same way. Any tips for handling the kind of different pulls from different senior stakeholders?
Well, I love what you said about asking questions. I mean, obviously, as you mentioned, environments are all different.
Yeah.
There's people with the official title, right? And those people sometimes can be stakeholders.
Yeah.
And then there's other people with influence, people that may not have the title, but their opinion carries weight.
Yeah.
And so if they can influence the project, if they're people that are impacted by the project, you need to ask a lot of questions, a lot of digging. I think when you build a building, one of the things we do is you dig down to the bedrock, right? And you anchor the building down in something solid. The same thing with discovery or scope management. You've got to find those stakeholders that are bedrock, that are the people who, they're very, whose opinions really matter. Because I'll be honest with you, Mike, I've learned the hard way. I've done projects before where I thought I was working with a key stakeholder.
Yes.
And then the real key stakeholder found out later on that I was doing the project. And even though the project was going well and it was a great project, because they had not been involved in the beginning, they shut it down because I didn't do my homework properly and didn't get to bedrock. So you've got to ask questions. And depending on your organization, as you said, you may have a large organization. I've worked with enterprises, have multiple layers of management. So the person that signs the check may be the CFO and maybe 20 levels above you. You're not going to talk to them.
Yeah.
But the local management, whoever the highest level of the local group, generally you're going to find a key stakeholder there.
Yeah.
And sometimes, especially in IT, if you have a developer or if you have a senior technical resource and architect, those are the people that they may not have the formal leadership title, but they have so much weight in the organization. They have such deep knowledge that you've got to include them, because otherwise you're going to get off track, and you're not going to be successful by not including the technical leaders.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think when I think about stakeholders and the authority that stakeholders have to influence the project, I always remind myself that there are two forms of authority. There's hierarchical authority, the people with the big offices and all those trappings. But there's also the intellectual authority, the people who actually will be able to give you answers which check out technically, even if politically they're the wrong answers. And you've got to weigh that political hierarchical authority against that technical authority. And I think that brings us on to how do you reconcile those? I mean, it may be technical versus political view. It might be two diverse political opinions. It might be a legitimate debate about two technical solutions, which are not necessarily reconcilable to one another. So there could well be a right or a wrong. How do you find resolution to those sorts of problems, issues, whatever you want to call them?
Well, this is where you get into that complexity, as you mentioned before. I mean, because discovery is so important, it's also very difficult. What I found works best for me, and I use the 3D process and the ITPD method, as you mentioned earlier, is you interview. You can do it as a group. You can do group interviews. Those can be dicey, especially when you have people with dramatically different opinions and roles. Doing group interviews I know according to the PMBOK, that you can do that, and
Yeah.
you can if you have general alignment and you're just working out the details.
Yeah.
But when you have strong stakeholders with different, strong opinions, what I've enjoyed doing is interviewing them individually
Yes.
or reaching out to them. Hey, do you mind if I get some time on your calendar to make sure that we get your input on what we're going to accomplish? And so I have a project charter, and I have a series of questions I ask them. A lot of stakeholders want to know what's in it for me. So you've
Mm.
got to say, okay, what do you want? What are your goals? And so in the interview, I asked them questions. What are you looking to accomplish? What's important to you? What is not important to you? What do you not want included? Exclusions, assumptions, constraints. And ultimately, I want to ask them, what does success look like? What does success look like? And so by interviewing, and I use the same standard questions all the time, but by interviewing those key stakeholders, and then what you do is you gather their different inputs and you
Yeah.
kind of try to combine those into a master scope statement or charter, and that you review as a group.
Yeah.
Once you gather those individual
Yes.
feedback, you consolidate them, put them together, and then I think it's a good idea to review and get everybody to sign off on that consolidated, combined document.
Yeah, that's exactly my process. Always start learning what the stakeholders want from the individual stakeholders. They can talk much more freely. But when it comes to reconciling the views, to actually forming the final document, you've got to get them together. There is years ago learned mediation, and it is a mediation process. And the mediation process is find out what each party wants and do some shuttling to make offers. But at some point, to get that final reconciliation, you've got to get them into the same room and you've got to facilitate a discussion, because you can't make a decision. And while you and they are in separate rooms, they are never going to be confident that the decision is their own. They're going to be thinking, oh, maybe that's Joseph imposing a decision on us, which is not our role as project managers. Our role is to facilitate the process and make that happen. So you bring them together and use whatever tools, and I think that's probably outside of the scope of what we've got time for today. But you've got, I'm sure you've got your tools. I've got my tools. Every project manager with some experience develops a toolkit for driving that consensus. But I want to move us on now. Let's say we come out of that room with a big smile on our face because actually everyone has signed up, and we are convinced, and they are convinced that there is agreement about what the priorities are and what the scope statement's going to be. How do you take that kind of all that stuff that's buzzing around in your head and the notes in your book or whatever, and turn that into a document? What's your process for that?
So that's a great question, Mike. I think I use what I call a project charter. I know as you mentioned, different project managers use different names for it, but essentially it's a cornerstone document, just like any foundation of any building.
Yeah.
You have a chief cornerstone.
Yeah.
And that cornerstone is the key Lego or the key Jenga piece that keeps it all together. If you take that out, it all falls apart.
Jenga's a better metaphor, I think, because if you pull the wrong one away.
Exactly. And that's the document. So you got to take those inputs and get everybody to sign off. And then as a project manager, I love what you said. You are not the decision maker. You're not a key stakeholder.
Yeah.
You execute their vision.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so you take all those. I use a project charter, and I put together all the deliverables, the assumptions, constraints, the project team, the success factors, a clear scope statement. Put it all together, and then you get their formal sign off. And then once we have formal sign off, what I do is I schedule a project kickoff. So after you've gone through the blood, sweat, and tears of coming together, and everybody, it's hard because people have to let go of things that are important to them for the greater good.
Yeah. Yeah.
So once everybody's finally agreed, I like to transition things over to what I call the design phase, but it's really the planning phase as well. You get everybody together for a kickoff. So I like to take that and to move towards a kickoff that gets everybody, this is what we agreed to, and this is how we're going to get it. So your planning, your timeline, your schedule, all those things come. And with the kickoff, you have a nice, solid, combined launch of your project to the next phase, where everybody can feel good about it and feel validated and feel like their opinions were heard and that they're on board.
Brilliant. Yeah. that project charter is a very common name, certainly here in the UK as well as where you're working in the States. But we do hear other names, whether it's just simply a scope statement or outline project initiation document. My preferred title is the project definition statement, because that takes it beyond the scope, but as does your charter. So when are we finished with scoping? But you've said it's the most important bit. I've said it's the hardest bit, without a doubt. It will be good to have it done. So when is it done? When is it finished?
Well, kind of the gate for me is when that project charter is signed. When it's signed, that's when, yes, everybody's on the same page. You're done. Now it's time to fill in the blanks. Your WBS. Okay, you got your charter. That's just a single document. That's not going to cover all the sub steps and all the subtasks that will achieve that. So when it's done, once we've completed that initial push, and we have sign off, I consider the design phase complete, or the discovery complete. Now it's time to move into planning. So that's from my 3D process. That's what we do, is we that written approved document. That's the discover gate, I call it, which really means, yes, you now have a green light. You can proceed with the design phase. Yeah.
But of course, for anyone who's thinking, oh, phew, I'm done with scoping completely, let's not forget that what that really means is it enters into change control and version control, because and I know you do a lot of IT projects, so you'll be very familiar with Agile. We're talking primarily in a predictive, traditional kind of paradigm here. Whether you're hard Agile or whether you are in a completely predictive paradigm, for me, the scope is, you need to lock the scope to plan. But once you've got a plan and the real world starts interacting with that plan, you are going to have to be prepared to accept changes to scope. I don't want to get into the whole subject of change control, but have you got any simple tips for our listeners about maintaining a good quality scope through the lifetime of what could be a long and difficult project?
No, I do have some tips. So that is probably one of the hardest jobs of the project manager. We herd cats, we do. Sometimes we're adult babysitters, Projects tend to get off, I think it's the whole ego versus id, Lord of the Flies. We can talk about that, but essentially human nature and project nature is to get off track. That's why, so what I do is I have a project run book, and I have the project charter is right there in the run book. So we see it I call them project accountability reviews each week. You've got to make sure when you build your plan, you're referencing the charter. In fact, I take my project charter and I export those deliverables directly into the plan. And I export all functions of the charter go into the plan. And then each week as we meet, as new tasks are requested, I pull up the project charter. I mean, the project charter, I've been in organizations where it's a dead document, where once it's done, it's filed away. You never see it again. Yeah, that's not healthy. That's not useful. No. So I keep it as a reference and a rubric to keep me honest and keep us on track. And so, like you said, as the project progresses, when new tasks are added outside of the initial planning phase, you need to go back to your charter and look, is this in scope? Does this fit within the parameters of the charter? And if it doesn't, as you mentioned, a project change meeting needs to happen, and you've got to make sure they understand the impact to your project. And that's where the rubber meets the road. That's the marathon, right? The discover is kind of a sprint, but once the project's running, keeping people on track and keeping people within the scope of the charter is probably one of the hardest parts of our job. Yeah. And if you don't do that, your project will go over budget, go over time, and you'll ultimately fail. So it's so critical. And as a project manager, you need to keep that project charter at the center of your mind and your focus.
Yeah, it always seems to me that the three most dangerous words in the world of project management, and the three words we fear most are the words "could you just," because that will happen. Stakeholders will come up to you, whether they are senior stakeholders or junior stakeholders. And you've got a budget, you've got a project, you've got a team. Could you just? And the answer is, how does that reconcile back to the charter? How does that reconcile back to the scope statement? Because if it doesn't, then you're going to have to go through a formal process to get that approved, because it's going to cost money, it's going to take time, it's going to introduce risk, and I think that's a key point to bear in mind. This has been really, really interesting. Before we wrap up, is there any other kind of tips, nuggets around the subject of scoping that haven't come out, or anything I should have asked you that I didn't, that you want to chip in?
Honestly, Mike, I think you've covered all the high points. I mean, the thing is, I think for a new project manager, it's just overwhelming. It's overwhelming to think how do I move forward? And a lot of the times it's easy to get bullied. If you're a new or inexperienced project manager, you can get bullied by those key stakeholders.
Yeah.
Start the project already. Why are we talking about it? I want results. Go. Go. What? And I think that we as project managers, we have to guard people from themselves. We have to protect people from themselves in a way. We've got to be the ones who have the character to be able to say no.
Yeah.
And that, you mentioned your mediation training.
Yeah.
That's such a good idea, because we are mediators. Our job is to bring everybody together. And so, we've got to make sure we don't start the project until we have consensus, until we have that cornerstone document, the project charter or the project definition, as you call it. That is that core foundation before you get started.
Yeah.
Don't fall into the trap, and don't let them pressure you to get started before you have alignment, or in the end, you'll be blamed and it will be your fault.
Yeah. I like that, protecting people from themselves. And of course, we're also protecting our team leaders, our work stream leaders and technical experts from stakeholders. We need to get between them so that they don't feel that pressure. We take that upon ourselves. But that takes me into another of my hobby horses around servant leadership, and I shan't take us there. Joseph, this has been really interesting, and I'm sure a lot of people watching will be interested to see what you've been writing and saying about project management, and finding out more about your thoughts. Where can people engage with you and consume some of your content? Because I know there's some really good stuff that you prepared that's available online.
Well, thank you, Mike. I have a website like everybody and their dog has these days. Phase3it.com is my website. I'm on YouTube, Phase3it, and I share a lot of video content there. I'm working on some new courses. I'm trying to work on some new courses about the ITPD, and I've also written an ebook that I'm giving away for free: how to rescue failing projects, and it's built on my experience. So those are three things. I am on LinkedIn and Facebook, but I have to be honest, social media, I'm not as active as I should be. But those are good. Those are good ways to get a hold of me, and of course, my email. You can reach out to me anytime. I'm Joseph at phase3it.com.
Splendid. I'll put all the links that you send me below in the description for people to click on. Obviously, some of them have come up on the screen as you've been talking. But I would endorse the free ebook. It is well worth downloading. If you're a new project manager, it's a great way into the basics of project management. The 3D process is simple, straightforward, and effective. And I would certainly recommend that if you like YouTube videos and you consumed all of mine and there's just no more left in my channel, then go straight to Joseph's, because there's some really good stuff, including I think you were telling me earlier, a video which covers in a straight, simple, concise way your approach to scoping. I had a look at that, and it covers some of what we've talked about today, but it also has some other little bits and flavors. So if scoping's of interest, then go have a look at that. Joseph, it has been a delight, and you've given us loads of value. So I want to say thank you very much for joining us. Thank you very much, Joseph.
Thank you, Mike.
Please do give us a thumbs up if you like this video. I'll be creating loads more great project management content. So please subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss any of it. And I'll look forward to seeing you in the next video.